Imagine being placed beneath a massive wooden board, while medieval engineers calmly explain that the device you're about to experience has been specifically designed to crush your body so gradually that it might take weeks for you to die, with each additional weight being calculated to increase your suffering without mercifully ending your life too quickly. They tell you that the crushing pressure will be applied according to a precise mathematical formula developed through years of experimentation on previous victims, ensuring that your ribs will crack one by one, your internal organs will compress and shift in specific sequences, and your consciousness will be maintained throughout most of the ordeal so that you can experience every moment of your slow destruction. What makes this revelation even more terrifying is learning that this isn't an improvised torture method, but a carefully engineered system called peine forte et dure that represents medieval technology's most sophisticated approach to the problem of causing maximum suffering through systematic compression. The peine forte et dure, literally meaning hard and forceful punishment, was developed specifically as an alternative to traditional execution methods when authorities wanted to extract confessions or information from victims while providing them with the psychological torture of knowing that their suffering could end at any moment if they simply agreed to cooperate with their interrogators. Unlike quick execution methods that ended suffering rapidly, this device was engineered to create a prolonged psychological battle between the victim's will to resist and their desperate desire to escape the gradually increasing agony that would eventually crush them to death. The genius of the system lay in its ability to give victims the illusion of control over their fate, while systematically breaking down their physical and psychological resistance through the inexorable application of weight that could be stopped, reversed, or accelerated based on their willingness to provide the information their torturers sought. The mechanical sophistication of the crushing device reveals how medieval engineers had applied advanced mathematical and engineering principles to the problem of human destruction, creating systems that could apply precise amounts of pressure while allowing for careful control over the rate and intensity of compression. The basic apparatus consisted of a heavy wooden board placed on top of the victim's chest, connected to a system of levers, pulleys, and counterweights that allowed operators to add pressure in precisely measured increments. The most sophisticated versions incorporated gear mechanisms that could multiply the applied force while providing fine control over the compression rate, ensuring that the crushing process could be calibrated to the victim's physical characteristics and resistance level. Some devices included measurement systems that could quantify the exact amount of pressure being applied, allowing operators to work within specific parameters that would maximize suffering while avoiding accidental death. The anatomical knowledge that informed the design of crushing devices demonstrates how medical understanding had been perverted to serve the goal of prolonging torture rather than healing, with detailed studies of human physiology being conducted specifically to understand how the body responds to systematic compression. Medieval physicians working with torture specialists had mapped out the precise sequence in which different body systems would fail under increasing pressure, identifying the optimal pressure ranges that would cause maximum pain while keeping victims conscious and alive. They understood that initial compression would force air from the lungs while making breathing increasingly difficult, that continued pressure would begin to crack ribs and compress internal organs, and that the final stages would involve the complete collapse of the chest cavity and the crushing of vital organs. This knowledge was used to calibrate the torture process so that victims would experience each stage of their destruction in the most psychologically devastating sequence possible. The psychological techniques employed alongside the crushing device were as sophisticated as the mechanical systems themselves, with interrogators using the gradual nature of the compression to create psychological pressure that was often more effective than the physical torture in breaking down the victim's resistance. The slow application of weight, created extended periods of anticipation and dread that could be more psychologically devastating than sudden intense pain, while the ability to stop or reverse the process at any moment gave interrogators powerful leverage over their victims. Skilled operators would vary the pace of compression, sometimes adding weight rapidly to create panic and fear, then slowing or stopping the process to allow the victim to contemplate their situation and consider cooperating. The most effective interrogators would engage in detailed conversations with their victims during the crushing process, describing exactly what was happening to their bodies while offering immediate relief in exchange for the information they sought. The legal framework that governed the use of peine forte et dure reveals how sophisticated jurisprudence could be corrupted to serve systematic torture while maintaining the appearance of legitimate judicial procedure. The crushing punishment was specifically reserved for defendants who refused to enter a plea in criminal cases, with the legal theory being that the pressure would encourage them to participate in the judicial process rather than remaining silent about their alleged crimes. This legal fiction allowed authorities to apply extended torture, while claiming that they were simply encouraging cooperation with legitimate legal procedures rather than punishing the accused for their actual or alleged crimes. The gradual nature of the punishment meant that it could theoretically continue indefinitely until the defendant either entered a plea or died, creating a legal framework that essentially authorized torture to death for the crime of refusing to participate in one's own prosecution. The economic motivations behind the use of crushing torture reveal how financial incentives had corrupted the justice system, creating situations where the torture process itself generated revenue, while the victim's property could be seized regardless of their guilt or innocence. When defendants died under peine forte et dure without entering a plea, their property could not be legally confiscated as punishment for their crimes, but it also could not be inherited by their families since they had never been formally convicted or acquitted. This legal limbo allowed authorities to seize estates while avoiding the legal complications that would arise from either conviction or acquittal, making the crushing device a profitable tool for generating revenue from wealthy defendants regardless of their actual guilt. The economic incentives were so strong that some authorities would deliberately select wealthy defendants for crushing torture, even when evidence of their guilt was weak or non-existent. The social spectacle aspects of public crushing executions transformed these torturous deaths into elaborate entertainment events that could draw crowds of thousands while serving multiple propaganda functions for the authorities who organized them. The slow nature of the crushing process made these executions ideal for public viewing, as spectators could observe the gradual deterioration of the victim over hours or days while being educated about the consequences of resisting legal authority. Viewing stands would be constructed around crushing sites, while vendors would sell food, drink, and souvenirs to spectators who treated the events like festivals. The extended duration of crushing executions allowed for elaborate ceremonial elements, including speeches by religious and civil authorities who would explain the moral and legal significance of what spectators were witnessing, while using the victim's suffering as an object lesson about justice and divine will. The international variations in crushing techniques reveal how different cultures had adapted the basic concept of compression torture to fit their particular legal systems, religious beliefs, and technological capabilities. French authorities developed elaborate mechanical systems that could apply pressure with mathematical precision, while German states created portable crushing devices that could be transported to different locations for maximum public impact. Italian city-states incorporated artistic elements into their crushing apparatus, creating devices that were aesthetically impressive as well as functionally effective. Spanish authorities combined crushing with other forms of torture, creating hybrid systems that could inflict multiple types of suffering simultaneously. English versions of the crushing device were designed for maximum psychological impact, with elaborate ceremonies and procedures that emphasized the victim's choice between cooperation and continued suffering. The medical intervention systems that were developed to support extended crushing torture demonstrate how healing knowledge had been completely corrupted to serve the goal of prolonging suffering rather than relieving it. Physicians would monitor victims during crushing sessions to ensure that they remained conscious for as long as possible, using their medical expertise to determine the optimal pressure levels that would cause maximum pain without causing immediate death. Medical support included techniques for reviving unconscious victims, treating injuries that might interfere with continued torture, and managing the victim's overall health to ensure that the crushing process could continue for extended periods. Some facilities employed full-time medical staff whose sole responsibility was maintaining victims in conditions that would allow for prolonged torture while preventing premature death from medical complications unrelated to the crushing itself. The record-keeping and documentation systems associated with crushing torture created extensive archives that provide disturbing insights into how systematic torture had become a form of administrative science with its own professional standards and quality control procedures. Detailed logs were maintained of every crushing session, including information about the victim's physical responses, the psychological techniques employed, the duration of the torture, and the ultimate outcome in terms of confessions extracted or information obtained. These records were analyzed to identify optimal crushing techniques and to develop best practices that could be applied to future victims. The documentation also served legal purposes, providing evidence that proper procedures had been followed and that the torture had been conducted according to established protocols rather than arbitrary cruelty. The technological evolution of crushing devices throughout the medieval period demonstrates how torture techniques were continuously refined and improved based on empirical observation of their effectiveness and efficiency. Early crushing devices were relatively crude affairs that often killed victims too quickly through excessive pressure or mechanical failure. Later versions incorporated sophisticated feedback mechanisms that allowed operators to fine-tune their application of force, while improved materials and construction techniques made the devices more reliable and effective. The most advanced crushing apparatus included automated systems that could apply pressure according to predetermined schedules, ensuring consistent torture experiences while reducing the skill requirements for operators. Some devices incorporated safety mechanisms designed not to protect victims, but to prevent accidental damage to the equipment itself. The psychological impact on the families and communities of crushing victims reveals how this form of torture was designed to terrorize entire populations rather than simply punishing individual criminals. The extended duration of crushing executions meant that family members and friends were forced to watch their loved ones suffer for hours or days, creating traumatic experiences that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Communities where crushing executions took place often reported long-term psychological effects, including increased rates of mental illness, domestic violence, and social dysfunction that persisted long after the actual torture events had concluded. The public nature of crushing torture was specifically designed to create these broader psychological effects, with the goal being to discourage resistance or dissent throughout the entire population rather than simply deterring individual crimes. The resistance and survival strategies that some victims developed during crushing torture provide heartbreaking insights into human resilience and the will to survive even under the most horrific circumstances. Some victims learned techniques for distributing pressure across their bodies to minimize damage to vital organs, while others developed breathing methods that could help them maintain consciousness despite chest compression. A few individuals managed to survive extended crushing sessions through sheer physical strength and psychological fortitude, though they were often left with permanent disabilities and trauma that affected them for the remainder of their lives. The accounts of these rare survivors provide some of the most detailed first-person descriptions of what it was like to experience systematic crushing torture while maintaining the will to live. The religious and philosophical justifications that were developed to support crushing torture reveal how theological and intellectual frameworks could be corrupted to rationalize systematic cruelty while maintaining claims to moral authority and spiritual legitimacy. Church authorities developed elaborate arguments claiming that the gradual nature of crushing torture provided extended opportunities for repentance and spiritual preparation that quick executions would deny to condemned sinners. Philosophers wrote treatises explaining how the victim's choice between cooperation and continued suffering demonstrated the operation of free will and divine justice, while legal scholars argued that the extended nature of the punishment was actually more merciful than quick execution because it provided multiple opportunities for the accused to end their suffering by choosing to participate in the legal process. The eventual abandonment of crushing torture came not through humanitarian reform, but through practical recognition that the method was economically inefficient and legally problematic compared to other forms of punishment and interrogation. The enormous time and resource requirements for extended crushing sessions made them impractical for routine law enforcement, while the legal complications arising from defendants who died without entering pleas created administrative burdens that outweighed the technique's supposed benefits. The development of more sophisticated interrogation methods and the rise of professional police forces reduced the perceived need for torture-based confessions, while changing legal systems eliminated the procedural gaps that had made crushing torture technically legal. The decline of crushing punishment thus reflected practical rather than moral considerations, demonstrating how institutional cruelty often ends through pragmatic calculation rather than ethical awakening. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the history of crushing torture reveals the extraordinary human capacity for creating systematic suffering while maintaining institutional and personal claims to moral legitimacy, professional competence, and legal authority. The crushing device wasn't the product of individual sadism or primitive brutality, but of sophisticated institutional planning that applied advanced knowledge and technology to the problem of causing prolonged human suffering while serving multiple organizational goals. The fact that entire professional communities could develop around perfecting compression torture while maintaining their sense of righteousness and social responsibility demonstrates how completely ordinary people can be conditioned to participate in systematic cruelty when it's presented as necessary service to legitimate authority and higher moral purposes. What do you think about this absolutely horrifying demonstration of how mechanical engineering and medical knowledge could be systematically applied to the problem of causing prolonged suffering through gradual compression? Can you imagine the psychological horror of being slowly crushed to death while knowing that your torment could end at any moment if you simply gave your torturers what they wanted? The fact that this torture method was legally sanctioned and professionally administered really makes you wonder about the capacity for institutional evil that exists within supposedly civilized societies when they prioritize abstract goals over basic human dignity, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about how contemporary institutions might be using different but equally systematic techniques to break down human resistance and extract compliance through prolonged pressure and suffering. If you found this investigation into one of medieval torture's most psychologically sophisticated techniques as disturbing and relevant as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about how human intelligence and institutional authority can be corrupted to serve systematic cruelty rather than justice and human welfare. Ring that notification bell, because our next deep dive will explore another example of how technological innovation can be turned toward perfecting human suffering when societies abandon moral constraints in favor of instrumental efficiency. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between expertise, authority, and human rights forever.